Greetings and welcome there, academic proletariat, to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will be talking about the English colonial regions and how they came of age. So, you started off class today with a literacy test. Hopefully, that went well. If you want to, you can go ahead and pause me right now and talk about that with your friends. See how you did. If not, we can just keep right on going. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the British colonial regions and how they came of age, which means we have to talk about kind of how the British succeeded in something, which is never my forte, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so before we start, I want you to ponder this document. So I'm going to throw the document up there, you pause the video, and talk about what you see, what the purpose of the document is, who you think the intended audience of the document is, the historical context, and perhaps the point of view. All right, so go ahead and pause it and take a look at that. Okay, so I got a lot of issues with this document, as you can probably imagine. First of all, their use of F's as S's. You probably picked up on that one. Makes it kind of hard to understand. But apparently the English, particularly the Puritans, thought that they were running an errand into the wilderness. Now, what does this term wilderness mean? Well, the wilderness is somewhere that you've never been before, and usually caters to the likes of beasts, barbarians, wild animals, and such. Or it can refer to a place where there's not really anything at all, anything of consequence, that is. So the English thought that they were running an errand into the wilderness. Now, what kind of errand do you think it is? Well, the person putting forth this errand is a pastor from a church, and therefore you can only assume that it is the Lord's or the God's errand that they're running. I'm sure you run errands for your parents all the time. They're usually things that you don't want to do. That are, get in the way of you doing other fun stuff. And so the English are acting as though this errand into the wilderness is it's sort of getting in the way of other stuff that they would like to do. It's something that they don't really want to do, but God wills it, and so they have to go. Now they call the place that they're going the wilderness. Problem with that, of course, is that there are people there. They were in the form of Native Americans, and even though, they weren't seen at the same level as the Europeans, they were still people. So this shows that how the Europeans viewed themselves in relation to the natives was a little bit backwards from the very beginning. Okay, so our colonial discussion last class in the class before talked about how this whole thing got started. So if you want to go ahead and pause me, talk with somebody around you, or think to yourself if you're watching at home, how these things led to the point that we're going to begin discussing now. So go ahead and pause. Okay, so there were several conflagrations in Europe, so problems that were happening in the various countries. There were wars and there was discontent, and a bunch of these different reasons caused people to desire to expand their wealth and desire to seek wealth elsewhere. So Europeans seek to expand. They need this to support their mercantilistic endeavors. They need colonies to make money, and of course this culminates in Columbus opening the floodgates. Once Columbus opens those floodgates, Spain colonizes the Middle and South America, makes a lot of money. England and France follow suit. They come to North America, and Britain particularly develops along the eastern coast of North America. And that, of course, is looking for new areas. However, we're going to go ahead and do a basic look at the different areas, the two main colonial regions that were colonized first. So I'm going to show you a map, and I want you to pause it after I put the map up there, and I want you to talk with the people around you or yourself if you're watching at home. Look at this map and try and figure out what this tells you about the people who lived in this area, their values, their beliefs, their ideals, and their practices, and we'll talk about some when I come back. So here's the map. Pause me, take a look at it. One note, those circles are plantations. Okay, so go ahead and pause. And I'm back. So here's what you should have realized. Well, that's a pretty big area, and the plantations are pretty big. And as you can see, even though they seem close together in places like this, they're actually, on the whole, pretty far apart, which means a couple of things. One, there probably wasn't a lot of contact between the plantation owners all that much. They met once in a while to have political meetings at the House of Burgesses. But other than that, they were relatively isolated, which means that schooling was done at home. There wasn't a tight-knit community. The roads were probably not that great, and people were living in a pretty hyper-individualistic society. Their goal was to make money. And I want you to take what you can note from this map, and I want you to think about it in terms of the different factors going into the settlement of Virginia. Okay, so the Virginia Company was a joint stock company from England, and in 1607 it was pooled money together from its investors and settled in Jamestown, which was on the eastern coast of North America. Now, how a joint stock company works is instead of one person putting forth all their money to go out on a risky venture like settling in the New World, you get a bunch of different people to give a little bit of money, and you get what's called a joint stock company. It's very similar to owning stock today. So, the investors in this joint stock company wanted a quick payback, and so they sent out explorers and settlers to who settled in Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, and they were looking for gold because that's what they thought that they were going to make money off of. Okay, so they don't find gold. In fact, before they find anything, they almost all of them almost die. But they're saved by the Indians, of course, and they hang on just long enough to realize that they can make money by growing tobacco. Tobacco grew very well in the region. The natives taught them how to grow tobacco in addition to food, which they didn't bring any of. And so once they realized that tobacco was going to be their ticket to fame, they started to grow it a lot. And once they started to grow it a lot, they organized into plantations, which means that there was a low population density because people lived really far apart. Now, the people who lived here adhered to the Anglican Church, but only after their commitment to money. So they were not religious zealots from the very beginning. They weren't looking for religious freedom. They just happened to bring their religion with them. Now, initially, the settlers in Virginia were mostly men who brought with them pickaxes and things that you would search for gold with, and also goldsmiths and jewelers who were going to do the work with the gold. So they didn't really have a lot of farming expertise. So, like we said, they had to rely on the Indians, okay? And since most of the people there were men, they could have no natural rate of increase for the population, so they quickly started to bring over indentured servants to fill the labor vacuum that had been created by the death and the lack of newborns. So all of this put together, you have a very chaotic situation at first that is only stabilized when they stumble upon tobacco as their main product. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the other colonial region that settles early on, and that would be the New England colonies. Go ahead and take a look at this map and try and figure out some information about the people who live there, their values, their beliefs, their ideals, and their practices. So there's the map. Go ahead and pause me for a minute and talk with the people around you, or think to yourself at home, what does that map tell you about the people who live there? Okay, so there's a lot going on here that's very different from the map that we looked at before. First of all, this is a very small area of land, whereas the other one was a very large area of land. This is basically a little town. What do we note about the little town? Well, right in the middle of the town, there is the church, which means the church must be important. We didn't even see a church on the last map, and therefore this must be a big deal. There's also a town hall, which means that people meet to make political decisions. They meet to make political decisions, probably based on their commitment to the church. Um, they have a school in the middle of the town, which means that education is important. There's houses, there's communal land, there's commons, there's a cow pasture and ox pasture, which means that they're doing a lot of the farming on their own. They live in small houses, which means that they don't live on big plantations. You can see that this is a much different setup and a much different scenario than that of the Chesapeake. So let's go ahead and talk about the Puritan experience for a second. So Puritans were on a mission. And to make a note about them, the Puritans are the group that come after the Pilgrims. So we kind of just forget about the Pilgrims in our little story here because they're really not that important, and they're swallowed up by the Puritans later on. So we're just going to get the party started with the Puritans in 1630. Okay, so they settle in Salem, Massachusetts, which is right by where the Pilgrims had been. And one of their first main leaders, John Winthrop, writes this sermon called City Upon a Hill, in which he argues that the Puritans are a city upon a hill, which means that they look down on everybody else and everybody else looks up at them. This rhetoric has been used throughout American history, and this is one of the falsities that I want you to try and pick up on. When Ronald Reagan calls America a city upon a hill, he's evoking the same rhetoric that the Puritans used. But remember, they wouldn't have been there, they wouldn't have been successful had the Native Americans not been a better city upon a hill. So there's a little bit of misrepresentation based on how this is all remembered. Anyways, this is one of the most famous sermons in American history because this sort of shows how the European settlers, the English in New England, thought that they were better than everybody else. But it also tells us why they were there. They're a city upon a hill, and they're going to carry on God's message. They are there for religious freedom, as opposed to the people in Jamestown who were there to make money. The Puritans were already rich. They were a bunch of lawyers who had money. They didn't need more money. They were coming to America for religious freedom. When they got here, they set up a theocratic government, which means that the only people allowed to vote in those town meetings were full members of the church. So it was not by any means democratic, because if you were a woman, you were not allowed to vote. If you were a person of color, you weren't allowed to vote. If you did not go to the church, you weren't allowed to vote. If you were younger than the age of 21, you weren't allowed to vote. So there were many stipulations on that government. Now, the societal structure was based on nuclear families. One thing that you should have noted in the activity that you did after your quiz, the passenger list, is that there were a lot of young people and a lot of old people that came to New England, as indicated by this wonderful picture down here. Here is a standard Puritan family that, in addition to being very large and of varying ages, they have really small feet. See? Small feet. Anyways, this these big families, of course, were able to mingle with other families and produce more little Puritans, and so you got a population increase as time went on that was normal and quick. Okay, living in the area of New England also brought health benefits because it was colder there during the winter and fall times, killed all the mosquitoes, malaria didn't spread as quickly, and it was a much more healthy environment to live in. Now, as a result of there being a lot of little kids, there was an emphasis placed on education because everyone in New England had to read the Bible. And so you taught everybody how to read so that they could read the good book. Now, land expansion in New England was much, much slower than it was in the Chesapeake because they didn't need land to fulfill their goals. They were not there for money. They were not growing tobacco because tobacco doesn't grow in New England. It's too cold. Whereas in the Chesapeake, they were expanding very quickly because they needed more and more land for tobacco planting. This meant that the Puritans and other settlers in New England would get after the Native Americans much slower. However, they still did eventually. Okay, so here are some issues that arise in New England. One, people start to realize that this sort of very strict government and strict society that was based on Puritan ideals wasn't really that awesome. So you get a series of dissidents that start to speak out about it. The two most famous are Roger Williams, who basically says that Puritan control of the government isn't right. So he advocates for the separation of church and state, which he eventually installs when he founds Rhode Island nearby a little bit later on. The Puritans, of course, banish him because he's much too crazy, and so he goes and founds Rhode Island after he's banished. Another person who's banished is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson runs into some issues because she says that she can talk directly to God. She doesn't have to go to the minister first. Now, this is doubly bad because not only is she slapping the minister in the face, essentially, but she's also speaking out against this Puritan hierarchy, and she is a woman. Oh my goodness, she's a woman. And so that does not fly. Okay, so as time goes on, people in Massachusetts start to become wary of this whole full church membership thing, and they start to fall out. Just think about it. If you are somebody who has grandparents that are deeply religious and go to church all the time, there's a good chance that people in your family, perhaps even you, don't go as much as them. And that happened in Puritan land too. The younger generations didn't go to church and didn't emphasize church as much as their grandparents did, and as a result, the church membership started to decline. Now, the Puritan church realized that this was a big deal, so they had to amend that, and so they issued what was called the Halfway Covenant. This meant that no longer did you have to be a full church member to be embraced by the community, but you could be a half church member. Loosening restrictions didn't sit well with a lot of the full church members, which is something that you should keep in mind later on. Now, even though we said before that the Puritans were much slower with regard to their expansion, they eventually did run into the Indians, and when they ran in to Metacom's tribe in what is now Massachusetts, there was a large battle that ensued called King Philip's War, which is what the English called Metacom because, they're culturally insensitive. still are. And the war, while it was a Puritan success, it ended up killing 1/10 of the Puritan men, which is a big deal. Okay, and then the last thing that the Puritans run into is a crazy king back in England decides that the Puritans are much too crazy, and since they were, separatists, or at least had wanted to purify the Church of England, he decides to put them all under the control of one of his cronies, Sir Edmund Andros. So he creates the Dominion of New England. No longer is New England allowed to have political freedom. They're all brought under this one umbrella. Now, in England, after that whole Dominion of New England thing, which is pictured here, so instead of these colonies being independent, England slaps one big label on them and calls them the Dominion of New England. This eventually is going to be upset because in the 1640s there's an English Revolution that's led by Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, of course, does a terrible job ruling, so they have a restoration. They bring the king back to power, and then once the king manages to piss everybody in England off again, Parliament calls for the return of a friendly monarch and wife. So they call upon William of Orange and Mary, who was the king at the time's daughter, to come back from the Netherlands and rule England. Um, this is an event called the Glorious Revolution, which is glorious because in England there is no bloodshed. However, they have themselves a political revolution. This is the context in which John Locke writes his 2 treatises on government, which is an important document that we are going to revisit later on. Okay. However, as a result of this glorious revolution and this sort of upsetting of English politics, there's an end of the Dominion of New England, and you see Massachusetts merge with Maine and become one giant colony. So that's why here you see the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Maine as part of Massachusetts. Now, as a result of this new government, they issue a Religious Toleration Act of 1690, which reduces the power of the Puritan Church and grants religious toleration to people living in the area. This is good if you're not a Puritan. However, if you're a Puritan, this makes you freak out. Okay, and this is sort of all going to lead to a crisis, which will be the topic for next time. Okay, we're going to take a field trip now, and we're going to go to the middle colonies. The middle colonies are the most important because these are the ones that students generally forget the most. So, stick with me here. The major middle colony is Pennsylvania. I call it the major one because it's not only the biggest, but it's the most populous at the time. It's founded by William Penn in 1681. He's a proprietor. He knows the king. The king hooks him up with some land, and eventually he's able to found his own colony, and so he does. And William Penn was a Quaker, and since his Quaker roots began in England, he's able to establish this religious haven for Quakers in the New World, and he brings a lot of Quakers with him. All right, so that's why Quaker Oats has a picture of William Penn on it. Now here's some interesting tidbits about the Quakers. They usually bought land from the Indians. They didn't just take it, or they didn't wrestle it away. They bought it, usually. However, there's this really awful story about how the Quakers were engaged in what's called the walking purchase, which they basically hired a bunch of really fast runners to stake off a very large area. The Indians said that they could have that they would sell the Quakers as much land as 4 men could run in 24 hours, or 4 men could walk in 24 hours. So the Quakers hired a bunch of people to run, and that sort of screwed the Indians out of the land. But shouldn't be shocked about that. I mean, after all, they were Europeans. Okay, this land was cheap. It was fertile, which means it was good for growing stuff. It's not good for growing tobacco, so don't even think that they were growing tobacco. It was good for growing wheat and grains. There's no tax-supported church. The church was a separate entity from the government. Even though William Penn was the governor, he allowed freedom of worship to all, and there was a representative government with the governor chosen by William Penn himself. So while he had sort of these significant rights to choose who he wanted to be in the governorship, there was representatives chosen by the people there. Okay, we call the the Quakers because when they were at church, they used to shake so hard when they got the feeling of God that they quaked. Okay, however, they called themselves a society of friends. So if you ever need to think of them, think of this society of friends. Okay, so more on the middle colonies. There were other ones. New York, Delaware, and New Jersey were the other ones. And if you look at that map on the right-hand side of the screen, it looks like a tie-dye shirt. And it looks like that because there were several different ethnicities in the middle colonies. It was certainly the most ethnically diverse area, and it had people from the various countries in Europe. It also had the largest colonial cities, New York and Philadelphia being them. It was nicknamed the breadbasket of the colonies because they grew most of the food that was consumed by the other areas. Of course, there was a lot of food being consumed by people in the South. Those people, of course, were slaves. Okay, so now let's move south and talk about the colonies in what we call the southern region, and that would be most notably the Carolinas. So the Carolinas were established by 8 people. That's it. 8 people established the entire Carolinas. So 8 friends of the king. And these 8 people are called proprietors because the king bestows upon them land. It was established on the fringe of Spanish Florida. So this is kind of a dangerous place to establish a colony because the Spanish are down here in Florida and can easily attack and manipulate you from the south. So in order to get a lot of people there to sort of fend off these attacks, but then also make a lot of money, the proprietors offered generous head rights. You might recall that the Chesapeake instituted the head right system, which offered 50 acres per family member and slave that was brought to the New World. But in the Carolinas, they offered 150 acres per family member. What does this mean? If you could pay to bring people over with you, you got a lot of land, which is why in the Carolinas there were massive plantations. Now, their main economic output was rice and indigo. Rice, of course, is an important food staple. Indigo is used in the dyeing of food. I am not saying anything about cotton yet because it is not there. Say cotton and get your lips ripped off. Okay, so how to tell the difference between the Southern and the Chesapeake? There's really the same thing. The difference is that the Southern colonies embrace much more gang style of plantation labor. So this is a picture of a tobacco plantation in the Chesapeake. That's a picture of a rice plantation in South Carolina. So you see that even while it was awful work and they were slaves, it wasn't as tedious and demanding as it was in the South. Okay, so here are our colonial regions. You should be able to identify them. You should have many opportunities to color them in your reading guide. You have an opportunity to color them in your notes for this. You should be able to identify New England, Middle, Chesapeake, South. Okay, hopefully you are able to do that now. That is the end, and hopefully you have fun playing the game the rest of the block. Don't miss me too much. I'll see you later.